Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere old. A place with creaking floorboards, yellowed wallpaper, and an attic door that never stays shut. The kind of attic that smells like dust and dried roses, where forgotten trunks wait in the dark, and you're not sure if the creaking above your head is just the house settling or something that remembers you. It's the kind of place where your childhood fears might still live. And tonight, we're going back. Back to Grandma's house. Back to the attic. Just a heads up, you probably won't survive this story with your nerves intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The drive to Grandma Esther's house had always felt longer than it actually was. Even as an adult, Naomi could never shake the heaviness in her chest once the trees began thickening along the road and the old rusted mailbox came into view. The house had stood at the end of Wren Hollow Lane for nearly a century, a pale gray silhouette buried behind willows and overgrown hedges. The wooden fence was rotting now, with slats missing like crooked teeth, and the porch sagged in the middle as if tired of standing. But the attic window, that round porthole of dark glass up in the gable, still watched the road like it always had. Naomi stepped out of her car slowly, the heat of the engine ticking down behind her. Leaves rustled overhead, though the air was still. She hadn't been here since Grandma's funeral 6 months ago. The house had been left to her, and today was her first time returning alone. Her plan was simple. Go and sort through the boxes in the attic, lock everything back up, and drive home before dark. The keys jingled in her hand as she walked up the steps, and the porch groaned beneath her. Inside, the house greeted her with that same scent. It had always held something like lavender mixed with dust paper and something slightly metallic underneath. She stepped into the foyer, her footsteps muffled by the faded runner rug. The living room was still. The doily-covered armchair faced the fireplace as if Grandma had just stepped out of the room. A cup and saucer sat untouched on the side table. Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she passed. She made her way upstairs without pausing. The steps were steep and narrow, each one familiar, but unfamiliar, like seeing a childhood drawing decades later. At the end of the upstairs hallway, the attic door waited. It was a pull-down hatch, the kind with a string dangling in the center. Naomi stared at it. For a moment, she thought about turning around. But her fingers were already reaching upward, already curling around the string. With a jerk, the wooden steps folded down. They groaned as they extended, and a soft draft of cool air wafted down from the opening. It smelled old, older than the rest of the house. Naomi swallowed, grabbed the sides of the ladder, and began to climb. The attic had always unsettled her, even as a child. It wasn't the dark. It was the way the sound changed up here. It was too quiet, but not silent. The kind of quiet that felt like something was listening. She stepped up into the space. Dust swirled in the narrow beam of light cast from the round window. The attic was larger than she remembered. Boxes were stacked in uneven piles. Old trunks lined the far wall, and a single wooden rocking horse stood in the center, its paint faded and peeling. Naomi blinked. She didn't remember the horse. She'd played up here once or twice years ago, but she was sure it hadn't been there. She stepped forward slowly. Her foot caught something, a thick, knotted rug stretched across the floor. She pulled her foot free and turned to move one of the closer boxes. As she opened the flaps, a cloud of dust burst up, making her cough. Inside were faded photographs, brittle newspaper clippings, and a worn, leather-bound journal tied shut with a blue ribbon. Her fingers hovered over it, then lifted it gently. The ribbon fell away on its own. She hadn't untied it. Naomi froze. The journal lay open to a page near the center. though the edges of the paper were so stiff, she couldn't imagine it had naturally fallen like that. The ink was old, a deep rust color that had bled slightly into the paper fibers. The handwriting wasn't her grandmother's. She knocks twice before entering. Once for the door, once for the mind. Don't open it. Don't let her see your eyes. Naomi felt the chill rise in her arms before the attic even responded. A soft creak behind her. Not the ladder, not the wind. Something heavier. She turned. The rocking horse had moved, not by much, just a few inches closer. She stared at it, heart pounding in her chest, throat dry. The air in the attic had gone heavier, like it had closed in around her. She set the journal back into the box slowly, her fingers trembling now. She didn't turn around again. She didn't move the other boxes. Something in her body and her bones told her not to. Instead, she backed away step by step until her foot found the top of the ladder. Only then did she turn slowly and descend without breathing. The attic door closed with a hollow thud above her, and the string swayed gently in the still air. She did not look up again. Not that day, not that night, and not for weeks to come. The days that followed her visit to the attic passed slowly, each one heavy with a kind of quiet unease Naomi couldn't name. She returned to the city, to her apartment filled with bright windows and clean lines, but something had followed her not in any obvious way. No footsteps, no shadows in mirrors, nothing she could point to and say, that doesn't belong. But the stillness was wrong. It clung to her things, to the spaces between hours. She'd set the old journal on her bookshelf intending to forget it, but her eyes were drawn to it every time she passed. It never moved. It never fell. But it always seemed to tilt slightly differently, like it was watching her return from work, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, Naomi would swear she heard the faintest creak in the walls around 3 a.m, not loud enough to wake her fully, just enough to catch on the edge of a dream. She tried to rationalize it, of course. Old houses settle. Memory plays tricks. Grief distorts everything. But when she closed her eyes at night, she no longer dreamt of people or places. She dreamt of her, the woman from the journal. She never saw her face, just the outline, a figure standing in the corner of the attic. One knock, then another, always at the edge of hearing, always closer when Naomi looked away. By the end of the week, she couldn't sleep at all. On the 7th night, she found herself sitting up in bed, staring at her closet door. Her room was dark, the streetlight outside casting thin shadows across her floor. There were no knocks, no movement. But she felt something, a pressure, as if something was pressed against the other side of that door, not waiting to be let in, just reminding her it existed. That morning, she packed a bag and drove back to Wren Hollow Lane. She didn't tell anyone, didn't leave a note. The house looked the same as before, old, tired, watchful. The attic window had fogged slightly in the summer heat, its shape blurred like a half-remembered thought. Naomi parked beneath the willow tree and sat in the car with her hands on the steering wheel for a long while. She wasn't sure what she expected to find, but her heart was already pounding before she even stepped onto the porch. Inside the house was cooler than expected. The air held that same stale perfume scent, layered with dust and time. Nothing had changed. The furniture sat in quiet poses. The hallway stretched out like it always had. And at the end of the hall upstairs, the attic string still dangled, barely swaying in a draft she couldn't feel. She didn't go up right away. She walked through each room, slowly touching the backs of chairs, running her hand along the wallpaper seams. Everything was still coated in her grandmother's presence, delicate and firm, like the pressed flowers in the books still stacked beside the reading chair. But the attic pulled at her. Late that afternoon, with the sun, a dull orange blur behind thick clouds, Naomi climbed the stairs and stood beneath the hatch. Her hand hovered over the string. She didn't want to open it. She needed to. The ladder unfolded with the same tired groan. The air from above spilled down cooler this time and sharper. It smelled less like old wood and more like iron, like rain that hadn't fallen yet. Naomi climbed. The attic was darker now. Storm clouds above had dimmed the light through the window, and the shadows leaned longer across the space. The boxes were where she had left them. The rug still lay in the middle. And the rocking horse, it was gone. Her breath caught. Her throat tightened. She stepped forward on instinct, scanning the corners, the low slope of the ceiling, the areas behind the trunks. Nothing. But then, far to the left, in a place she hadn't noticed before, a new shape. An old wardrobe. She was certain it hadn't been there. It stood tall and narrow, its surface covered in flaking green paint, its handle a rusted brass loop. A thin crack of darkness lined the edge between the doors. She didn't move toward it. She didn't want to move toward it. But her body began walking anyway. One slow step after another across the creaking floor. She stopped just short of touching it. There were no carvings, no markings. Just a wardrobe that looked too tall for the sloped ceiling, and yet it stood without pressing against the beams above. Inside she heard nothing. No breathing, no whisper. But something waited. Her hand rose almost against her will, and just as her fingers touched the cold metal handle, a knock echoed from the attic wall behind her. Twice, once for the door, once for the mind. She spun around. The attic was empty, but in the dust near the journal box, fresh footprints. Bare, small, facing her. Naomi didn't scream. She wanted to. Her throat tightened and her heart pounded in a painful, erratic rhythm, but the sound never came. Instead, she stood frozen, her hand still clutching the cold brass handle of the wardrobe, her eyes locked on the footprints pressed cleanly into the dust. They hadn't been there before. Of that, she was certain. 5 small toes, arches barely formed. Human, yes, but not right. Too narrow. Too light, like they'd been left by something that didn't weigh enough to exist. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not just the absence of noise, but a silence that pressed back. Naomi stepped away from the wardrobe. She didn't open it. Couldn't. Whatever was inside could stay there. She backed toward the attic ladder, eyes flicking to every corner of the room. The shadows had shifted again. They weren't longer exactly, they were closer. As though the room had drawn itself in, becoming smaller without physically changing. Her foot found the top rung of the ladder, then the next, and the next. Her body descending stiffly like a puppet on strings. She didn't dare look up. Only when she was safely back on the second floor did she reach up and shove the ladder closed. It sprang back into the ceiling with a dull snap, and the string hung down, gently swaying. Naomi stood there in the hallway for a long time. The house was quiet. Downstairs, the light had gone slightly orange, the storm clouds outside thickening. Rain hadn't started yet, but the air was electric. Everything in her body urged her to leave. Get in the car, drive, burn the house down if she had to. But she didn't move. Something anchored her. Instead, she made tea. She didn't know why. It was absurd. She stood in the kitchen, spooning dried chamomile into an old mesh strainer, filling the kettle with water from the tap lighting the gas burner. Her hands were shaking, but the routine soothed her. The way it always had. As a child, she'd done the same thing when storms passed through. At night, boiled water. Waited for the steam, sat in silence while the wind rattled the windows. She set the mug down on the kitchen table and sat across from it. For a while, she just stared. The tea-steeped tendrils of warmth rising, curling in the air. But she didn't drink. Instead, she reached for her phone. She wasn't going to call anyone. There was no one left to call. But she opened her photo app almost unconsciously and scrolled through her recent pictures. Not of the attic, not of the wardrobe. just the normal ones. The city, her desk, a meal she'd taken last week. But as she scrolled, something strange caught her eye. A photo she didn't remember taking. It was dark, blurry, and tinted blue with a strange curve in the top left corner. She tapped it. It expanded. The photo was of the attic, not the well-lit room she'd stepped into that afternoon, but a dim, distorted version of it. The angle was low, almost floor level, tilted slightly, as if the camera had been dropped. In the corner of the image was the wardrobe, its doors closed, and in front of it, a shape. It wasn't clear, just a vague impression. A long, pale smudge of a figure. No detail, no face, but the posture was unmistakable. Standing, watching, Naomi dropped the phone. The screen landed face down on the wooden floor with a sharp clack, but she didn't move to retrieve it. Her eyes were locked on the empty chair across from her. There were indentations in the cushion, deep ones, as if someone had just been sitting there. She didn't breathe, didn't blink. The attic door hadn't opened. She would have heard it, wouldn't she? And then 2 knocks, not from above this time, from the back of the hallway behind the pantry, a part of the house she hadn't thought about in years. There was a small door there nearly hidden behind a tall cabinet, a storage crawl space Grandma had called it. Naomi had never been allowed to open it, never asked why. She stood slowly, the chair legs scraping softly behind her. She crossed the kitchen. The knocking didn't repeat. It didn't need to. The silence behind the door was more terrifying than sound. She reached out. Fingers brushed the edge of the cabinet just enough to shift it an inch. And beneath the door, thin and curling, was a piece of paper, folded twice. Naomi crouched, hand trembling, as she picked it up. It smelled of dust and rose water. She unfolded it once, then again. The handwriting was the same as the journal, the rust-colored ink. She likes you now. You looked at her. That's how it begins. Naomi didn't open the door behind the pantry. She couldn't. Something about the way the air gathered near it, thickening, resisting holding its breath, kept her rooted in place. She stood there for what might have been minutes paper still in her hand, the ink beginning to smudge slightly, where her sweat touched the edge. The note had weight. Not physical, but emotional. Something deep and old pressed into every letter. She likes you now. Naomi didn't feel liked. She felt seen, as though all the thin layers of herself, her logic, her disbelief, her practiced calm had been peeled back with the flick of a single glance. And that thing in the attic, that smudge of a woman, it had seen her bare, not just her skin, but something more essential. She crumpled the note without thinking and shoved it deep into the kitchen trash. The paper gave a soft sigh as it folded in on itself. She pulled the cabinet firmly back over the crawlspace door until the outline disappeared behind chipped paint and wood grain. Then she walked to the living room and sat down. The armchair across from the fireplace still smelled faintly of lavender. The room hadn't changed, and yet it felt stranger now than the attic ever had. Like she'd stepped onto a stage just after the actors had left. Furniture waiting in poses, shadows pretending to be still. Naomi wrapped the old knit blanket around her shoulders, the one that had always been draped over the back of the couch, and leaned her head against the worn cushion. Her breath slowed. Her pulse didn't. Somewhere deep in the walls, a faint scratching sound stirred. Not mice, not creaking wood. Something slow, like fingers brushing across plaster in steady intervals. She likes you now. It was absurd. It had to be. But even the absurd felt plausible in this house. It always had. Even as a child, Naomi had sensed there was something beneath the stillness here. Something watching. Not malevolent, just waiting. She stood, suddenly needing motion, and returned to the foyer. Her grandmother's bookshelf still stood tall beside the stairwell, packed with old novels, recipe cards, and photo albums. Naomi pulled one at random and opened it. Photos of family reunions, smiles, picnic tables. Her grandmother standing beside people she didn't recognize their names, written in neat cursive along the bottom of each page. But halfway through the album, she paused. A photo older than the others, sepia-toned. A child standing beside a woman in front of the house. The child looked vaguely familiar. Big eyes, pale hair, awkward posture. But the woman, Naomi's hand began to tremble. The figure was tall, impossibly so, even given the warping of old photographs. Her face was turned slightly away, obscured by shadows cast by the attic window behind her. But the shape of her arms, long and thin, the odd curve of her neck, it wasn't right. Her name wasn't written. The space beneath the photo was blank. Naomi shut the album. She didn't sleep that night. She tried, curled beneath layers of blankets in her old bedroom, her eyes fixed on the closed door, every floorboard creak sending adrenaline through her chest. But sleep didn't come. At some point in the early hours, she must have drifted, long enough to dream. And in the dream, she was a child again, standing at the bottom of the attic ladder. Except it wasn't Naomi as she was. It was something wearing her skin. Her body, yes. But the inside had changed. She felt hollow, like the space behind her eyes had been swept clean. She looked up the ladder, and the woman was there, not moving, not breathing, just watching through the attic slats, face hidden behind the half-shut wardrobe door. One hand rested on the frame. Long fingers curled around the wood. She knocked, twice. Naomi woke with a gasp. Lungs-burning sheets tangled around her legs like restraints. The house was still dark, quiet, but on the nightstand beside her bed was the photograph from the album. She hadn't brought it upstairs. It lay face down on the wood, the backside now covered in the same rust-colored ink. A message. You are almost ready. She needs a place to stay. Naomi sat upright in bed, heart rattling like a drawer slammed in the night, her skin damp with sweat that had cooled too quickly. The air in the bedroom was still but charged. It clung to her skin, thick and unmoving, like the humidity before a storm, but colder, heavier. She stared at the photograph on the nightstand, unable to reach for it. Not out of fear it would move or change, but fear that it wouldn't, that it would stay exactly as it was. Real, unexplained, waiting. The message burned into her mind. She needs a place to stay. She whispered the words aloud as if saying them might strip them of power, but the sound of her voice felt foreign in the room, like it didn't belong to her. The walls didn't echo it back. They just absorbed it, greedily, hungrily. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed and stood legs stiff, knees protesting. The house was dark, but not fully. That dull, ambient kind of darkness that comes just before sunrise where the light outside begins to shift, but nothing inside has caught up yet. Her phone said it was 5:12 a.m. She left the room without the photograph, without the note, without a plan. Her bare feet moved silently across the hallway floor, past closed doors and faded family portraits that seemed to lean toward her, just slightly more than they had yesterday. She moved on instinct, not toward the attic, not toward the crawl space, but toward the back of the house. Past the kitchen, past the mudroom where the wallpaper curled at the corners. There was a door she hadn't opened in years. The cellar. She hadn't remembered it until just now. Grandma had never spoken about it. As children, Naomi and her cousins had dared each other to open it to go down into the dark, but no one ever had. The door was always locked. Always. But this morning it wasn't. The knob turned with a soft click, too smooth for a house this old. She paused, hand still resting on the cool brass heart thumping in her ears. There was no creaking wood, no dramatic groan of ancient hinges. Just a soft sigh of air as the door swung open and revealed a descending staircase cloaked in shadow. She should have turned away. She knew that. Every part of her that clung to reason, to safety, begged her to close the door and walk back upstairs. But her feet moved anyway, and the moment she stepped onto the first stair, the air changed. It grew colder, not in a way that made her shiver, but in a way that dulled her senses. Smells faded. The sound of her breathing flattened. The world narrowed. The steps were narrow and stone-lined, slick with moisture. The walls were close, forcing her shoulders inward. She moved downward slowly, counting each stair in her head without realizing. 19, 20, 21. At 27, the stairs ended, and she stepped into a space that felt both impossibly small and impossibly deep. The cellar wasn't empty. Old shelves lined the stone walls, cluttered with jars of cloudy preserves and rusted cans. Cobwebs hung like tattered curtains, and water dripped rhythmically from somewhere far off. But it wasn't the room itself that made her chest tighten. It was what stood in the middle, a mirror, tall, framed in black wood. It hadn't been there before. She would have remembered. It stood freely, not leaning against anything, with a thin film of fog on the glass, despite the still air around it. Her reflection stared back, pale eyes, sunken hair tangled, but it was off. Just slightly. The head tilted too slowly. The blink came half a second late, and worst of all, her reflection was smiling. Naomi wasn't. She backed away, but the mirror didn't change. Her reflection kept smiling, eyes locked on hers, that small curve of the lips stretching unnaturally long at the corners. Then, as she watched her mirrored self, raised a hand, not in mimicry, but independently, and placed a palm against the glass. And something behind Naomi knocked, once, then again. She didn't turn. She couldn't. Her body locked in place, spine stiff, eyes wide. The mirror fogged more heavily, the smile growing wider now, stretching too far, unnatural. The figure in the glass opened its mouth. Naomi couldn't hear what it said, but she knew the shape of the word it mouthed. Stay. That was when the basement light blinked on above her, not from her touch, but as if someone upstairs had flipped the switch. The reflection vanished instantly. The mirror was normal. Just a mirror. Naomi backed up the stairs without looking away. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. Her feet stumbled over the last few steps, and she shoved the door closed behind her heart, hammering like a war drum in her chest. But the house was quiet, too quiet. She walked back toward the foyer, unsure of what she had just seen, unsure of what she had become part of. But the photograph was gone from her room. The trash where she had crumpled the note was empty, and something heavy, something soft had been placed on her bed. It was the blue ribbon from the attic journal, and tied around it was a single strand of long white hair. Naomi didn't touch the ribbon. She couldn't bring herself to. It sat there like an offering on the center of her bed, deliberate, out of place, far too personal. The ribbon was unmistakably the same one that had tied the attic journal, the one she had left nestled inside a box she hadn't opened again. But now, it lay curled like a sleeping thing, its soft satin edges stained slightly darker, near the knot, as if something had soaked through. The strand of white hair wrapped around it was impossibly fine, nearly translucent. It didn't belong to her. It didn't belong to anyone she remembered. She backed out of the room, leaving the door open behind her. The house no longer felt familiar. Every room had become an echo of itself, stretched too thin in some places and too thick in others. The floorboards groaned not with pressure, but with memory. She could feel the weight of footsteps that weren't hers, like something had walked these halls long before she returned and continued walking them, even when she slept. In the kitchen, the windows had fogged slightly from the inside, not from heat, from breath. She wiped one with the sleeve of her shirt and peered out. Nothing, no movement, but the willow tree out front had shifted. It bent subtly in one direction, as if leaning closer to the house, as if listening. She turned away. Her hands were shaking again, but not from fear, from exhaustion. She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Her body ached with that raw, haunted fatigue that came from too much stillness and too many half-formed thoughts. She wanted to scream, but the silence in the house was so complete, so still, that she feared her voice would never return if she tried. Instead, she sat at the dining room table and opened her notebook. Not the attic journal, her own. She needed something normal, something hers. She flipped to a blank page and wrote in small, careful print, "I am not alone in this house, but I am also not entirely myself. Something is watching. Something knows me. And I think I know it too." The last sentence disturbed her. Not because it was untrue, but because it felt inevitable. She stood suddenly and grabbed the attic key from the drawer beside the pantry. It wasn't locked, but holding it gave her purpose. She climbed the stairs with deliberate steps. The hatch loomed above her string, dangling like a lure. She pulled it down, and the ladder unfolded again. The sound was louder this time. Not the creak of wood, but the wet whisper of something shifting above her, something dragging along the attic floor. She climbed quickly before she could change her mind. The attic greeted her like a lung exhaling. The air was cold and damp, the light from the circular window barely piercing the gloom. Shadows stretched long between the boxes and trunks. Dust hung like smoke in still beams of light. The rocking horse had returned to the center. This time its head faced her directly. Its eyes were chips of glass, clouded but focused, and beside it on the rug the wardrobe stood wide open. She hadn't opened it, and yet there it was, mouth agape, doors yawning toward her, the inside impossibly dark. There were no shelves, no coats, no visible interior at all. Just depth. A low thudding pulse started in her ears. Not sound sensation. The wardrobe breathed. Slowly, in, out. She stepped forward. The floor felt soft beneath her feet, like the wood had thinned beneath the rug. The light shifted slightly less from the window, more from something else, a quiet glow that pulsed behind the wardrobe's darkness, a promise of depth of invitation. And inside, faintly, something moved. Not fast, not threatening, just the sound of someone rearranging themselves in the dark. Naomi's voice, dry and brittle, escaped her lips in a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Silence. Then, a voice not heard but felt in the deepest part of her spine. "You already know. You've always known. You opened the door." Naomi staggered back, breath catching in her chest, the cold air slicing her throat. She turned, ran to the ladder, descended in a rush, nearly slipping on the bottom rungs. She shoved the attic hatch closed above her, and this time she tied the string in a tight knot to the stair railing, her hands working without thought. She stumbled into the hallway and froze, because now resting on the floor just outside her bedroom was the attic journal, open, waiting, and in its center freshly written in rust-colored ink, "She is patient, but she is already inside." Naomi didn't pick up the journal. She stood there staring down at it, heart beating in slow, dense thuds that seemed to echo louder than any sound the house could make. The handwriting was the same long strokes, sharp curves, not quite cursive, but not clean print either. It didn't feel like something written by a person. It felt drawn like symbols in a ritual, like words formed not to be read but to mark. She is patient, but she is already inside. Naomi backed away from the doorway, her body unwilling to cross the threshold of her own bedroom. The ribbon was still on the bed, the hair still wrapped around it. The entire room felt like a set, now something arranged for her, not by her. Like stepping into it would complete a ritual she didn't agree to. She went downstairs instead, moving fast, but not running. Running would acknowledge something was wrong. Running would give it permission to follow. In the kitchen, the air felt thicker. She opened every window she could find, letting in humid summer air, the buzz of cicadas, the distant hiss of wind pushing through tall grass. But the feeling didn't leave. It clung to the walls, to the wallpaper, to the empty chair by the table. Naomi sat staring at the wood grain of the tabletop, trying to remember something, anything about the attic from her childhood. But memory felt smeared, like she had avoided remembering it, as if her mind had built a barrier, not from trauma, but from subtle warnings she hadn't understood at the time. Only one thing came back clearly, her grandmother's voice sharp and low, saying, "Don't ever open the wardrobe. Let the dust cover it." Naomi had thought it was just another one of Grandma Esther's odd superstitions, like crossing silverware would invite bad dreams, or that birds tapping on windows were omens. But now it felt different. It felt like a warning, not from fear, but from experience. She stood and walked to the bookshelf again, pulled down the same photo album, flipped to the same page. The tall woman standing by the house, face turned, hand resting lightly on the shoulder of the small child. Only now, Naomi noticed something she hadn't before. In the far background, barely visible past the edge of the frame, someone else. A figure in the attic window. Just a suggestion of a shape, but undeniably there. Watching. Naomi stared at it for a long time. Then she removed the photograph and held it to the light. The paper was thick and textured, the kind used in the 1940s or earlier. On the back, in faint pencil marks, was a single word written in all capital letters. Vessel. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew what it implied. Something inside her was shifting. Not a possession. Not fear. It was like a key turning in a lock she didn't realize existed. This woman, the one in the photograph, the one in the wardrobe, the one from the mirror, wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a spirit trapped in a house. She was a pattern, a repeated shape, something passed down. Naomi brought the photo into the living room and sat by the fireplace. She didn't light it, just stared into the cold grate as if it might give her answers. The journal still lay upstairs. The ribbon still waited. And yet the house didn't press in anymore. It breathed slow and rhythmic, as if matching her pulse. She wasn't being hunted. She was being taught. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the chair by the window and watched the moon rise behind the willows, letting the silver light cast long, swaying shadows across the lawn. She watched as the attic window caught the reflection glowing faintly like an eye. And at exactly 3:03 a.m., as the wind stilled and the air thickened again, 2 soft knocks echoed from above. Not from the hatch, from the ceiling, right above where she sat. Naomi didn't flinch. She simply whispered, "I hear you." The knocking didn't come again, but in her chest something answered. The next morning arrived without light. The sky outside remained a flat shade of gray. Not quite rain, not quite dawn, and the house was filled with a weight. Naomi couldn't explain a heaviness, not in the air, but in time itself. Everything moved slower. The kettle took longer to boil. The clock ticked softer. Her own breath felt shallow, distant, as though she was watching herself from across the room. She didn't try to chase the feeling away. There was no point pretending things were normal now. Not after the knocks. Not after what stirred inside her when she answered. She returned to the attic. Not out of fear or obligation, but with the quiet resolve of someone finally choosing to look beneath the bed instead of lying awake, dreading what might crawl out. The ladder was still tied, the string looped in a knot she barely remembered making. She untied it slowly, fingers steady. The hatch lowered without resistance, no sound but the whisper of wood and air. As she climbed, she didn't count the steps this time. She didn't hold her breath. The attic was exactly as she'd left it. Wardrobe open, rocking horse, watching boxes undisturbed. but the quality of the space had changed. It didn't feel threatening. It felt alive, not warm, not welcoming, just aware. Naomi stepped onto the rug and approached the wardrobe again. The darkness inside still pulsed faintly, but not with menace, with waiting. It reminded her of old wells, deep unseen things that didn't reach for you but still pulled. She reached into her pocket and withdrew the photograph. Vessel. She held it in her palm and looked into the darkness of the wardrobe. Who was she? She asked aloud. Her voice didn't echo. It just sank into the air like a drop of ink in still water. And then from the very back of the wardrobe, something moved. Not forward, not closer. Just a shift, like someone standing up after sitting for a very long time. Naomi didn't step back. She stood still, listening, feeling the attic adjust around her. A whisper drifted out. Not words. A sound like breath across stone. Then the light in the room dimmed, not from the window, but from inside her eyes. Her vision narrowed. The rug beneath her feet shifted. For a moment, she wasn't in the attic at all. She was somewhere beneath it. Stone walls, water dripping in the dark, a corridor with no doors. And at the far end, standing perfectly still, was the woman, tall, pale, hair falling like a curtain, eyes not glowing but wide, deep, infinite. Naomi couldn't move, couldn't speak. She didn't know how long she stood there. But then the woman raised her hand and pointed, not at Naomi, but past her, behind. Naomi turned slowly, heavily, like turning in a dream, and saw herself, her own body seated in the attic, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, still holding the photograph. But her chest didn't rise, didn't fall. Then the vision cracked. The corridor shattered like glass. The woman dissolved into mist, and Naomi was back, still standing, still holding the photograph. But the wardrobe was now closed. The rocking horse was gone, and behind her in the dust were her footprints and a second set identical facing them. She descended the ladder without thinking. Her muscles moved without her. She returned to the bedroom. The ribbon was gone. The hair was gone. But on the bed now was the journal reopened to a new page. The ink still wet. She showed you the hollow. Now you must fill it. All vessels leave a shape behind. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed and let the words sink in. The truth was forming now, slowly, like condensation on glass. The house wasn't haunted. It was a container, a memory held too tightly, a shape that waited for someone who could remember it from the inside. And she, Naomi, was being fitted into that shape. The more she resisted, the harder it pulled. But now, for the first time, she wondered what might happen if she didn't resist at all. Naomi didn't leave the house that day. She sat at the kitchen table as the light shifted outside from gray to a pale, sickly yellow, and eventually to dusk. She didn't eat, didn't drink. Her thoughts were too loud to let her body speak. Her fingers rested on the table, occasionally twitching as if remembering some forgotten piano piece. The journal lay open beside her, untouched since that morning, but the words continued to echo in her mind. All vessels leave a shape behind. She wondered what kind of shape her grandmother had left, and whether it had ever really left at all. Evening brought wind. Not strong, not dangerous, just enough to rustle the trees and stir the willows in long brushing waves. The sound was comforting in a way that frightened her. The house breathed with it. Every groan of the walls, every sigh through the window panes seemed to move in time with something much older than this place, something ancient, wearing the house like a mask. Naomi stood up slowly and walked to the front hallway. She passed the mirror without looking in it. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd see, a version of herself waiting just a little too long to follow, smiling a little too wide. At the base of the stairs, she paused. Her feet wanted to go up, to return to the attic. But instead she turned and walked back to the living room. The fireplace still sat cold. The rug beneath it looked freshly vacuumed despite years of dust. And on the mantel, something she hadn't noticed before, a small wooden box. She opened it. Inside, a handful of objects. A child's marble, a yellowed button, a silver ring she didn't recognize, and a folded piece of paper brittle with age. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was different this time. Neat, feminine, graceful. It was her grandmother's. If you're reading this, then you've seen her too. You were always sensitive. I tried to keep the house quiet while you were young. Thought if I closed the doors tight enough, she wouldn't find her way into your skin. But that's not how she works. She listens through blood, through memory, through stillness. If she's chosen you, it's already begun. The only thing you can do is decide how you'll carry her. Naomi didn't cry. She sat with the note for a long time, the fireless hearth casting long shadows around her. The sky outside had darkened completely. The wind had settled. But inside, something had shifted again. She stood, walked back upstairs. Her body felt lighter now. Not free, never free, but balanced, like she finally understood the rules of a game she'd been playing blind since birth. The attic hatch was still closed. The string didn't move. She climbed it anyway. The room was waiting, the wardrobe open. But this time, there was no darkness, no pulsing breath, no whisper. Only light, faint blue-gray like dawn pressed through fog. And in the center of the attic sat the rocking horse. On it a girl, no older than 5. Pale skin, long black hair. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and her hands rested lightly on the painted mane. She looked up when Naomi entered, and her eyes were familiar, not because Naomi had seen them before, but because they looked like hers. The girl said nothing, didn't need to. Her presence wasn't threatening. It was offered, like a memory too painful to accept, but too important to let go. Naomi took a step forward, then another, and in her mind, a voice. Not the girl's, not the woman's, but hers from somewhere deeper. This is where it starts over. This is where you remember what you were made to forget. Naomi knelt beside the rocking horse. The girl leaned forward and pressed her forehead gently to Naomi's. And in that moment, Naomi remembered the smell of old wood and dust and lavender, the way the attic felt when she was small, the figure in the wardrobe she was told never to speak of, the nights she woke with scratches on her arms, though no one believed her, the song her grandmother hummed to keep the rooms quiet. She hadn't been imagining it. She had just been too young to understand she'd already begun to change. The attic held its breath. Naomi knelt there, forehead still pressed to the child's, her knees resting against the dusty rug, every inch of her skin buzzing with memory. Not the kind she could sort through like photographs, but the kind buried in the marrow, old and heavy and inherited. She didn't cry. The moment didn't allow for it. Instead, she listened not to the child, not to the silence, but to something deeper. The little girl pulled back. Her face was calm, unreadable, ageless, in a way that felt neither innocent nor ancient, but something in between. Her eyes met Naomi's unblinking. Then she slid off the rocking horse and walked toward the wardrobe. Naomi watched, breath shallow, as the girl stepped into it, not with fear, but with purpose, and disappeared into the light. The wardrobe door remained open, but the light had dimmed. The humming that followed was soft, like an old lullaby half remembered. Naomi stood and crossed the attic, stepping slowly toward the wardrobe's edge. She didn't look inside. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached out and gently closed the doors. The latch clicked shut with a sound that echoed faintly through the beams above her. Behind her, the attic felt quieter. Still strange, still alive, but no longer looming. It had shifted into something more familiar, something that recognized her now, that acknowledged her. The threat hadn't passed, but it had changed its shape. Back downstairs, the house no longer resisted her. The light in the hallway flickered softly, but didn't fail. The kitchen faucet no longer dripped, and the photograph was gone from the mantel, as if it had fulfilled its part in the story. Naomi sat on the couch and pulled the journal into her lap. Pages she hadn't seen before had appeared filled with entries all in the same rust-colored ink, but the handwriting subtly evolving. At the top of one page was her own name. Below it a line, "Some inherit blood, others inherit memory. She chose me for both." Naomi read through the pages, and with every word the pieces of her grandmother she had never understood began to fall into place. The silence, the rules, the rituals that had seemed like eccentricities now glowed with meaning. Esther had not been afraid. She had been preparing, holding the line, shielding Naomi as long as she could. She flipped to the final page. It was blank. The ink well had dried. The ribbon was gone. The book was no longer writing itself. It was hers now. Outside, the wind began again, this time from the east. The willow tree swayed gently, and Naomi felt something lift from the house, not leave, but shift, like a great weight had adjusted its posture. The cellar door creaked. Just once. Not opening, just reminding her. Naomi didn't flinch. She set the journal on the table and walked to the front door. When she opened it, the air smelled clean, full of damp soil and cut grass, and the echo of summer. The world outside continued as it always had, but she didn't step through it. Instead, she stood in the threshold and whispered, "She's not alone anymore." And from the attic above, just faintly so soft it might have been imagined, came a knock. Just one, not a warning. An answer. The days that followed passed, not in peace, but in a quiet. Naomi had begun to understand one that wasn't absence, but presence held just below the surface. The house breathed around her. The air moved without breezes. Shadows fell where they pleased. But she was no longer startled by them. She didn't flinch when the stairs creaked on their own, or when the hallway light clicked on at exactly 3:03 a.m. She simply nodded, listened, responded if only with stillness. She found herself settling into routines again, but they were different now, gentler, slower. She swept the floors in the mornings. She opened windows when the sky allowed. She lit candles in the rooms her grandmother used to pray in. She didn't question why. It felt less like she was performing tasks and more like she was continuing a rhythm that had been paused and now resumed through her hands. The journal remained on the table in the living room. Naomi no longer read it. She didn't need to. It felt finished, though it would never be complete. Some stories weren't meant to end, only to change keepers. On the fourth morning, she found a new object on the kitchen counter, a porcelain cup, old but not dusty, with a delicate crack along the rim. It hadn't been there the day before. Inside it sat 3 dried rose petals. The moment she saw them, a memory returned. Not a vision, but a scent. Her grandmother's hands, always warm and dry, cupping a similar teacup and saying softly, "She visits through symbols. What she doesn't say, she shows." Naomi carried the cup upstairs and placed it on the small table beside the attic ladder. A gesture, a kind of offering not of submission, but of recognition. That night the wardrobe didn't open, but Naomi dreamed. In the dream, the house stood in a field of tall silver grass that whispered when the wind moved. The sky above was dark, not with storm, but with weight, a vast dome of stars that pulsed in slow intervals. She stood outside the house barefoot, her feet sinking slightly into the cool soil. The windows glowed softly like eyes that had grown tired from watching, and on the porch stood the woman. Not a monster, not a ghost, just a shape made familiar through fear, now revealed in full. She was beautiful, in the way old trees are bent, weathered but unmoved. Her hair fell in ribbons of black and white, her face pale but without age. Her eyes were deep but not hollow. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Naomi stepped forward. The woman raised a hand, not in warning, but in greeting, in acknowledgement. Naomi raised hers in return, and when their palms met, Naomi awoke. The house was quiet, the attic closed, but on the nightstand beside her, placed carefully, was a new journal, bound in dark leather, its pages blank, waiting. The journal was heavier than it looked. Naomi picked it up with both hands, feeling the cool leather cover and the slight give of the spine like it had already been opened by others long before her. The pages inside were thick, off-white, edged in faint specks of dust that hadn't come from her room. There were no markings, no inscriptions, no title, no dates, just space. A wide, expectant silence between covers. She turned the first page. Still blank. She closed it again, slowly, carefully, and placed it back on the nightstand. Not yet. The moment hadn't arrived, but it would. She could feel it the way water feels the coming shift of weather before the sky changes. There was something forming now, something new. The rest of the day passed without event. The house no longer felt oppressive. It was in its own strange way companionable. Naomi no longer felt watched. She felt accompanied. When she moved from room to room, the air followed softly. When she paused in the hallway to glance out the window, the curtain stirred on its own, as if the house itself wanted to look with her. She walked through each room like she was reacquainting herself with a memory she'd once left behind. The small bedroom with the lace curtains now seemed to hum gently in the afternoon light. The sewing room, still stacked with yellowing fabric, no longer smelled of dust but lavender. Even the cellar, once cold and stone-slick, now held only shadows that rested instead of reaching. But the attic remained unchanged. She hadn't gone back up since closing the wardrobe. Not out of fear, but respect. Some doors weren't meant to be shut and locked, only acknowledged. The act of closing them was a conversation, not an end. That night, she brought the journal to the kitchen and sat at the table the same way her grandmother had years ago. The lamp above her hummed faintly, casting a circle of golden light over the old wood. She placed a pen beside the journal and opened it to the first page. Her hand hovered. What do you write to something ancient? To a presence that has shown you pieces of yourself you didn't know you were missing. She began with only one line. I understand now. Then nothing. She waited, and then slowly, like fog curling in from a distant field, words began to appear beneath her sentence. Not in ink, but in pressure, like something had been etched lightly with a finger. Then you may begin. Her breath caught. The house didn't move. Nothing stirred. But she felt it. That deep shift again. Something giving her space. Permission. Not instruction. Not demand. She wrote another line. What are you? The reply came quicker this time, rising softly like steam from warm earth. A shape. A memory kept alive. A name not spoken aloud. I am what grows in the spaces you leave behind. Naomi's hands trembled, but she didn't stop. Why me? Because you heard the silence and answered. Because you did not run. Because your blood remembers. She closed the journal not from fear, but from reverence. Something had changed again, not outside her, inside. She knew now that the house didn't choose people. It waited for those already chosen, and she was the next keeper of the story. The following week folded in on itself. Days melted into one another, not in a blur, but in a kind of layered stillness, as if each moment stacked atop the last with quiet purpose. Naomi no longer kept track of time in the traditional way. She rose when the light through the window shifted from slate to silver. She ate when the house felt hungriest, though her appetite came and went like tide. The journal remained at the kitchen table, its pages filling slowly, not always with her hand. Sometimes she'd wake and find words waiting. Sometimes she would write a single question, close the book, and return to find not just an answer, but pages of something deeper, recollections, fragments, even drawings. She never heard the pen move, never saw the ink form, but it came always in the same pressure-filled script that was not quite hers, not quite Esther's, and definitely not human. And the more the house gave, the more she remembered. Not as memory exactly, but as familiarity, the way one remembers a song before they know they've heard it. She'd touch certain places in the house and feel her chest tighten with unspoken recognition. The window seat in the upstairs hallway, where she used to sit with books as a child, now evoked not comfort, but longing, as if someone had waited there patiently watching her, not to harm, but to protect, or prepare. The attic, though untouched, remained aware. Every now and then, as she passed beneath the hatch, she would hear a soft shifting above her, like something adjusting position or turning pages in a large, dusty book. She didn't climb the ladder again. Not yet. That story had reached a pause. Another was beginning to bloom. It revealed itself in subtler ways. One afternoon, while digging through the shed out back, she uncovered a metal tin filled with slips of paper. On each was a single name written in red pencil. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's, though many of the names were unfamiliar. Some were crossed out. Some had small dates next to them. She recognized two distant cousins she hadn't seen since childhood. One had vanished without explanation during a summer trip. The other, she'd heard, had grown increasingly withdrawn and institutionalized by her mid-20s. Next to Naomi's name was a question mark. She didn't take the tin inside. She reburied it beneath the floorboards where she found it. Some things were not for unraveling. At least, not yet. That evening, a new item appeared in the house. On the nightstand beside her bed, where the first journal had been, sat a small glass bell. Smooth, empty, silent. Naomi lifted it gently and found a note beneath it no larger than a matchbook, written in the delicate, old-fashioned hand she'd come to know well. Use this only when the shape threatens to forget itself. Ring once, no more. She set it back down without ringing it. She didn't need to. She still remembered who she was. But the note made it clear that could change. That night, she didn't dream in the usual way. No woman in the field, no corridor of stone. Instead, she found herself walking through the house, only everything was reversed. The rooms opened into one another in impossible sequences. Hallways spiraled inwards, staircases curved through the ceilings, and in every mirror she saw a version of herself, but older. Worn, beautiful in a hollow, terrifying way. Each one whispered different words, but they all mouthed the same final phrase, "You are what remains." When she woke, she found her feet were dusty. Bits of thread clung to her nightgown. A pale splinter nestled in the flesh of her palm. She removed it with tweezers and dropped it into the sink. It dissolved into nothing. The house had let her move deeper, had opened one more door while she slept, and in the journal on the first page of a new section she hadn't written, waited a message. There are fewer of us now. The line thins. You must begin to shape the house back. It listens to you. She stared at that last sentence a long time, then reached for the pen. Naomi dipped the pen in ink without thinking, though she hadn't remembered refilling it. The tip met the page and moved easily, her hand guided more by feeling than language. She didn't draft or pause. She simply wrote, letting the words come as they would. The walls are folding. The house is breathing. I am not outside it anymore. She finished the sentence and sat back, letting the final loop of her handwriting dry across the parchment. Outside, the wind had picked up. It didn't blow hard, but steady like a long inhalation before a storm that never quite arrived. The trees beyond the garden bowed gently toward the house. Not in surrender, but in respect. For the first time, Naomi walked barefoot into every room. She touched the walls, ran her fingers across old wallpaper-cracked door frames and dusty windowsills. In the dining room, she noticed the chair at the far end had shifted an inch closer to the table. In the sewing room, a single pin lay on the cushion in the exact center of the stool, standing upright, perfectly still. In the upstairs hallway, the painting of the lake, the one that had hung crooked for years, was now level. The house was listening. It responded not to commands, but to presence, to her attention. It adjusted itself when she walked through it with awareness. The floorboards quieted when she passed. The light fell in smoother patches, and the silence grew thicker, not in warning, but as if it were wrapping her in fabric. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ridge and the rooms filled with a syrupy gold, Naomi found herself outside for the first time in days. She stood barefoot on the porch, staring out at the willow tree. It moved gently, each branch lifting and swaying like arms stirred by deep water. Its bark was darker than she remembered, and at its roots were small stones arranged in a circle, 12 of them. She didn't remember placing them, but she recognized the shape. It was in the journal. Page 46. A containment ring, a welcoming gate, a memory trap. It was not meant to keep things out. It was meant to help them return. Naomi walked down the steps across the brittle grass and into the ring. She stood in the center and closed her eyes. The wind stopped. The earth went still, and for a brief moment, she felt her body split, not painfully, not violently, but gently. One part of her remained in the ring, still and upright. The other moved sideways into something wider, deeper. She didn't leave her body. She expanded beyond it. In that shape, she saw the house as it was not wood and stone, but memory and gravity and silence. A place stretched across generations, built not only by hands, but by remembering. She saw Esther Young standing in the attic facing the wardrobe. She saw the child on the rocking horse again, laughing softly. She saw figures blurred, distant, moving in and out of the house like tides. And above all, she saw the woman not as a ghost or creature, but as a form, an intelligence without ego, a mothering hunger that did not consume, but preserved. Naomi returned to herself with a soft breath, the kind one takes after waking from a dream they don't want to end. The air had cooled. The ring was unchanged. Back inside, she found the bell again on her nightstand. This time, it had moved a few inches to the left. A new note sat beside it, scrawled quickly, the ink a shade darker than before. One more door will open. Prepare the mirror. She understood immediately. Not the hallway mirror, the one that sometimes lingered behind her. The mirror in the cellar. She hadn't looked into it since that night. She had sealed it in her mind like a wound, like a gate she wasn't ready to cross. But the message was clear. It was time. She waited until nightfall. Then, carrying a single candle, Naomi descended the cellar stairs. The temperature dropped sharply the further she went, but she didn't shiver. The mirror was there, same as before, tall, framed in black. This time, however, there was no fog on the glass, no delayed reflection, no smile that didn't belong, only her. But her eyes were different now. She saw it immediately. They didn't reflect light. They held it. Naomi stood before the mirror for a long time, the candlelight flickering across the smooth glass surface. Her reflection stared back, not malevolent, not mocking, simply present, as if waiting for her to catch up with something she had always known, but never accepted. Her eyes were unmistakably hers, and yet they gleamed with a stillness that hadn't been there weeks ago. There was a knowing in their depths, a heavy, ancient knowing that pulsed like a thread, woven from something older than language. She reached out fingertips, brushing the cold surface. The mirror felt more like a door now, not literal or physical, but a boundary between layers of the self. On the other side was not a ghost or a haunting, but an accumulation. The echoes of everyone who had ever stood in her place and seen themselves become something more. She whispered, "I'm ready." The glass didn't ripple. The reflection didn't shift. But behind the image, behind the veneer of reality, she sensed movement. Not fast, not aggressive. A slow awakening. The feeling of layers pulling back, of something rising. The candle's flame bent toward the mirror and stayed that way, held by a breath not her own. From deep within the house, a low groaning vibration began so faint it could have been mistaken for a memory. It hummed through the floorboards, up the walls, into her bones. Naomi closed her eyes. The candle extinguished on its own. Darkness fell thick and velvet, but she did not feel fear. When she opened her eyes again, the mirror was gone. Not broken, not removed, just not there. In its place, an opening. Not a physical doorway, but an impression, a hollow in the world that led inward instead of forward. And at its edge, a set of stairs descending into dark. Not the cellar steps. These were different. Narrower. Stone carved by hand, uneven and worn smooth by centuries of passage. She hesitated, then stepped forward. The moment her foot touched the first stair, the entire house held its breath. Each step downward felt longer than the last, as though space itself had loosened. The darkness wasn't oppressive, it was total. A gentle shroud. It smelled faintly of rosewater and dust of pages that had never been opened. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a long corridor, with no walls, just endless rows of mirrors, each one tall and narrow, placed shoulder to shoulder. And in every one, a different version of herself, some older, some younger, some dressed in clothes from other centuries. One wore a red shawl embroidered with moths. One held a lantern shaped like a bell. One had no eyes, just shadowed hollows where memory should be. Naomi moved forward slowly. None of the reflections moved. None followed her until she reached the end. Here, the final mirror stood alone, framed in bone-white wood, and within it, no version of herself at all. Just a figure turned away. She watched for a long time. Then softly the figure turned. It was Esther. Not as Naomi remembered her, but younger, vibrant eyes sharp with pain and wisdom. Esther did not speak. She only nodded once solemnly and placed her palm against the glass. Naomi mirrored the gesture. Their hands aligned the cool surface between them, humming gently with recognition. And then Esther whispered, not with lips but with thought, "You must finish what I could not." Naomi whispered back, "I don't know how." "You will. The house remembers, and so will you." The corridor faded. The stairs returned, and when Naomi climbed them, the mirror was back in its frame. But this time it reflected more than just her. It reflected the house as it was now awake, listening, and deeply, deeply alive. Naomi didn't speak for the rest of the night. She returned to her room, moved like a ghost through the halls, careful not to disturb the hush that had settled over the house, like a blessing or a warning. Something had shifted after the mirror. The air was warmer but thicker. Objects remained where she left them, yet each now seemed imbued with intent, as though her touch had activated their dormant purpose. The journal lay open on the kitchen table again, even though she hadn't left it that way. A new page had begun, but only 2 words were written, centered on the top line in that rust-dark ink she sees. Naomi stared at those words. They didn't frighten her, not anymore, but they carried weight. not just of presence, but of expectation. The house was no longer testing her. It was preparing her for something. She didn't know what form it would take, only that she wouldn't face it uninvited. She returned to her bedroom and sat at the edge of the bed until morning. Her eyes didn't close. Her mind didn't wander. She simply waited. And when the sky lightened into that soft, gray blue of early dawn, the air in the room shifted again, just slightly, like a breath drawn near her ear. Downstairs, the front door had opened on its own. Naomi rose and followed the sound. Outside, the willow tree bent low, its branches nearly grazing the porch as if bowing. The circle of stones beneath it had changed. There were now 13, one in the center smooth and dark unlike the others. She didn't touch it. Instead, she sat at the edge of the porch and watched the field as the sun climbed behind a low bank of clouds. The world didn't feel separate from the house anymore. It was part of the same body, the same system. The land breathed with the same pulse as the stairs, the beams the cellar, and for the first time she felt it reach outward. She didn't know how she sensed it, but something inside the house had extended past its walls. Its memory, its will, now moved along the earth beneath her feet. It was growing not wildly, not hungrily, but carefully, intentionally. Something was being gathered. That night, Naomi lit a single candle in each room. She didn't say anything aloud. She didn't need to. She moved from floor to floor in complete silence, a quiet ritual blooming from instinct. Each candle burned without flicker, the flames high and steady, like small watching eyes. When she reached the attic, she paused. The hatch was open. She hadn't opened it. She climbed slowly, hand on each rung. Her breath calm, but measured. The attic had changed. The rocking horse was gone. The wardrobe was shut. And in the center of the room now sat a chair, a plain wooden chair facing the window. Naomi approached but didn't sit. On the seat lay another note folded crisply with her name on the front in tight slanted script. She opened it. When the 13th arrives, she must be welcomed. Let the house speak. Let the silence guide you. No signature, no time, no explanation, just a knowing. Naomi looked out the circular attic window. The sky beyond had turned slate blue again. The trees stood motionless. No wind, no birds, only stillness. The 13th had not yet arrived, but it was on its way, and Naomi, keeper of memory, ere to silence, would be ready. In the days that followed, Naomi felt the house begin to listen more deeply. It no longer responded only to movement or presence, but to thought. When she stepped into the sewing room and imagined sunlight, the curtains would shift on their own to let the light fall in gentle slants. When she entered the kitchen and remembered her grandmother humming by the stove, the kettle would begin to warm, though she hadn't turned the knob. These were not tricks. They were acknowledgments. The house was attuned, now attuned to her memory, her emotion, her acceptance. She had crossed a threshold unseen, and in doing so, the house had allowed her to merge with its quiet rhythm. Each night she lit the 13 candles again, letting them burn without interference. She placed them in the same order clockwise from the cellar to the attic, always ending at the chair in the attic window. The note still sat on the seat. She didn't move it. Each evening she read it again. When the 13th arrives, she must be welcomed. Let the house speak. Let the silence guide you. The words did not change, but her understanding of them deepened. The 13th was not just a person. It was a culmination, a moment that would arrive through someone, but would not belong to them alone. On the 7th night, just after 3 a.m., Naomi woke to find the window at the end of the hallway open. She had closed it before bed, she was certain. She stepped into the hall, barefoot moonlight spreading across the floor in a pale wash. Outside, the willow tree was swaying again, not from wind, but from something else, something rhythmic, a gentle motion like breath. The stone circle at its base shimmered faintly, as if touched by frost, though it was the middle of summer. Then she saw the figure at the edge of the field, small, still, a child, not moving, just standing. Naomi didn't panic. She didn't rush to the door. She stood in the hallway watching from the window and whispered, "I see you." The child didn't react, but the moment she spoke, the house seemed to inhale. A low hum passed through the walls, through the beams, down to the foundation. She turned and walked back into her room, lit a single candle, and waited by the window until morning. The child did not return, but the presence had been real. The 13th was near. The following day, Naomi took the bell, the small glass one she had been warned to ring only when the shape began to forget itself, and set it in the center of the stone ring beneath the willow. She placed it on the dark 13th stone, the one that had appeared without her doing. Then she knelt and whispered to the roots of the tree. She didn't know what words she said, only that they came from a part of her that had always belonged to the house. Her mouth moved softly. The soil grew warm beneath her knees. That evening the journal wrote back. She found it open to a new page. The ink still wet the handwriting, more delicate than before. The 13th is memory made flesh. She will come not knowing why. You must hold her gaze and remember what she forgets. You are the last branch of this tree. If she is not welcomed, the roots will pull inward. Naomi sat very still. She did not know how she would know when the moment arrived, only that it would come in silence, and when it did, she must not hesitate. Naomi woke before the sun. The sky outside was still a deep steel blue, and the house was holding its breath again. She could feel it in the walls and the pause between the creaks and the hush of the floorboards beneath her bare feet. There was no fear in the air, only readiness. She had dreamed of roots again, only this time they moved like veins beneath skin, glowing faintly beneath the surface of the earth. The willow had grown taller in the dream, its branches reaching toward the attic window like hands waiting to be held. She dressed in silence, pulling on the long linen shift her grandmother had once worn when tending to rituals she never explained. Naomi had found it folded neatly in the bottom drawer 2 days ago, untouched by dust or time. It fit her as though it had been sewn for this morning. She braided her hair without looking in the mirror and moved through the house with deliberate steps, lighting the 13 candles in their circle, 12 within the rooms, and the 13th left unlit set aside near the front door. The bell was still beneath the willow, unmoved, waiting. By noon, the wind had changed. It came from the west, now low and warm, carrying the scent of something forgotten. Dry roses, burnt sugar-damp cedar. Naomi stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the field beyond the willow, and felt her breath slow. She didn't need to look at the clock. She already knew. The 13th had arrived. A knock came soft, singular, like the gentle press of a memory returning. Naomi didn't flinch. She stepped to the front door, took a long breath, and opened it. The girl stood there, small, pale, no older than 10, with black hair that clung to her shoulders in waves. Her dress was plain. Her eyes wide and green shimmered with something too heavy for a child to carry. She did not speak. Naomi stepped aside. "You're welcome," she said softly, and the girl entered. The house did not groan. It did not shift. It settled, as if something long adrift had found its anchor. Naomi guided the girl through each room one by one. No words passed between them. The girl observed everything, eyes, sharp movements, graceful and cautious, as though she had seen these rooms before, but forgotten their weight. In the sewing room, she paused by the pincushion. In the attic, she stood quietly beside the chair, staring out the window toward the willow. Finally, they came to the kitchen. The candles still flickered softly. Naomi placed the 13th candle on the center of the table next to the open journal. She struck a match and lit it. The flame rose thin and tall. The girl sat across from her eyes, never blinking. Naomi looked down and saw the journal was no longer blank. Now you remember her, now you become her. The girl smiled, just barely. A slow, aching curve of the lips that held no joy, only release. Naomi reached across the table and took the girl's hand. It was warm, real, human. But within the touch pulsed something older than blood, a rhythm older than breath. The flame of the 13th candle bent sideways, then flared straight again. And in that moment, the house exhaled. The field outside swayed in unison. The circle of stones beneath the willow grew roots. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, in a place deeper than foundation, a new heartbeat began. The 13th had returned, and Naomi had remembered. That night, the house remained awake. Naomi could feel it humming not loudly, but deeply, a low vibration that threaded through the wood grain of the walls and the gaps in the floorboards. It was the kind of sound that wasn't heard so much as felt, like a distant storm beyond the horizon, or the first roll of thunder under skin. The girl, the 13th, slept in the small upstairs bedroom, beneath the slanted roof, the one that had once been Naomi's when she was young. She hadn't said a word since she arrived, but she didn't need to. The house was speaking for her now. It had taken her in, and in return, it had offered her back. Not as she was before, but as something remembered. Naomi sat by the attic window, watching the willows sway beneath the moonlight. The candle beside her still burned tall and unwavering. In her lap, the journal lay open to a fresh page. She hadn't written anything yet. She was waiting. The bell sat on the windowsill beside her untouched. There was no forgetting tonight. Not while the echoes of Esther and of those who came before stirred through every inch of the house like threads pulling tighter into a completed pattern. It was almost complete. She could feel it. A current building. Not of danger, but culmination. Downstairs, the wind moved through the cracks of the old front door, and Naomi heard it words barely formed, hidden in the rush of air and shadow. 3 more nights. That was all. Nothing else. She did not ask who had spoken. She did not call into the dark. She simply nodded and lit the next candle. In the following days, the girl never strayed far from the window. She would sit cross-legged on the floor, watching the field, as though waiting for something she could not name. Naomi fed her small meals, simple things, soft bread, warm broth, nothing too sharp or new. The girl never asked for more, never complained. Her appetite was small but steady, like a memory, learning how to be whole again. On the second night, the 13th candle burned blue. Naomi hadn't changed the wax or the wick, but when she lit it, the flame shimmered in a cold hue, casting elongated shadows that curved upward instead of away. She didn't look away. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the kitchen table, closed her eyes, and let the silence in. This time it spoke clearly, not through ink, not through whispers, but through sensation, a flooding of her thoughts with images that weren't hers. A stone path in a forest she'd never walked, a voice singing in a language she didn't know, a river of salt beneath the floor of a house that had once burned but left no ash. Naomi opened her eyes. The girl was standing at the edge of the kitchen, watching her with expressionless calm. "I saw her," Naomi whispered. The girl blinked once, then turned and walked away, and in her wake the candle's flame returned to gold. That night Naomi dreamed of the wardrobe again, only this time it was open, and inside it there were no shadows, no pulsing dark, only a mirror. And in the mirror not a version of herself, but the girl, dressed in Esther's shawl, mouth open, singing. Naomi woke with the song still echoing faintly in her ears, though it faded as she opened her eyes, as if the house were careful not to overwhelm her with too much truth at once. The room was dark, but not in the way of night. It was a darkness that held itself deliberately soft, almost maternal. She reached for the journal, and before her hand even touched it, the next page had already turned. No ink yet. Just an emptiness waiting to be filled, like the pause before an intake of breath. Downstairs, the girl was already awake. She sat at the dining room table, her bare feet swinging lightly above the floorboards, staring at the 13th candle. It hadn't been relit since the previous night, yet it stood tall and unburned, as if untouched by time. Naomi entered quietly, not wanting to disturb the air between them. But the girl turned her head anyway, her expression calm. Not curious, not afraid. She was aware always. Even in silence, she was listening. Naomi sat across from her. For a while, they said nothing. There was no need. The space between them was full of something stronger than words. Shared memory, inherited weight, the solemn understanding of those who are chosen to remember what the world forgets. Eventually the girl whispered, "She's almost here." Naomi didn't ask who. She already knew. That afternoon, the mirror in the hallway cracked, not shattered, just a single clean fracture running diagonally from one corner to the other. Naomi stood before it, studying her reflection. The split line ran across her chest in the glass, bisecting her heart. She didn't look away. Instead, she reached up and pressed her fingers gently to the crack. It pulsed. Behind her, the house exhaled. Later in the cellar, she found the stone steps again, the ones that had once vanished. They were back now, revealed in full, as if waiting for her return. But this time, Naomi didn't descend. She knelt at the threshold and placed a candle on the top step unlit. Another offering, a signal. She whispered into the dark, and in return, the dark whispered back. One more night, that evening, the girl finally spoke again. They were in the attic. The window was open, letting in the dusk light. Naomi had brought up the journal, though she hadn't written in it since the blue candle. It lay open in her lap, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze. "She's been waiting a long time," the girl said softly. Naomi nodded. "I know." She was the first, but she was also the door. And then she reached out and touched Naomi's hand. "Tomorrow she'll come through me. But it's you she'll need." Naomi's fingers tightened around the journal. "I'm not afraid. I know. That's why she chose this house again." The room quieted. Outside, the willow was perfectly still. Not a branch stirred. Naomi stayed with the girl until she fell asleep in the rocking chair. She carried her gently downstairs and laid her in the small bed in the old nursery, pulling the blanket up to her chin. She kissed her forehead, not as one might kiss a child, but as a keeper kisses a vessel. And then she closed the door. The night passed without dreams, but just before dawn, Naomi heard the wardrobe creak open again. And this time there were no footsteps, only the soft, steady sound of breathing. Naomi didn't move immediately. She lay in bed with her eyes open, heart steady, letting the sound of the breathing settle around her like fog. It wasn't loud, it wasn't urgent, but it was unmistakable, deliberate, patient, as though something had been waiting for her to wake before it continued its approach. The wardrobe door upstairs remained open, though she could not see it. She didn't need to. The sound traveled through the beams and floorboards, through the old pipes and walls, like a soft tide moving closer. She rose slowly and walked barefoot down the hallway past the framed mirror with its single crack, now faintly glowing in the moonlight. The girl's door was shut. Naomi paused outside it, hand resting on the handle. She considered opening it, checking to see if the girl was still there, still asleep, still herself. But she didn't. The time for questions had passed. Some transitions required solitude. Instead, Naomi made her way up the attic ladder, one rung at a time, the wood groaning beneath her weight. not in protest but in recognition. At the top, the air was colder. Not icy, but thin and charged like the air before lightning strikes. The window was still open, but the night outside had thickened. The stars were hidden behind layers of moving shadow, and the willow below swayed in stillness. The wardrobe stood open. No light spilled from it now. Just darkness, pure and matte, pressing against the edges like water behind a dam. And from within it, the breathing continued slow, deep, as though lungs the size of the house itself had settled behind the door. Naomi approached and stopped. Inside the wardrobe stood a woman. Not a ghost, not a shade. She was tall, draped in a black shroud that moved even without wind. Her face was partially hidden beneath a veil, but Naomi could see her mouth pale, unsmiling, perfectly still. She exuded no malice, but the air bent around her as if gravity had become aware of her presence. Naomi knew without doubt that this was her, the one the girl had spoken of, the one Esther had waited for, the one Naomi was born to meet. The woman stepped forward, one foot then another, slow and weightless. Her veil did not shift, but when she stopped just inches from Naomi, the breathing ceased. Now there was only silence. Naomi whispered, "You're here." The woman raised a hand not to touch but to gesture toward the journal Naomi held tight to her chest. A page flipped open on its own, and words began to write themselves across the parchment in the same slow, deliberate hand. "You hold the house. I am what was left behind, what was buried in the silence, what memory forgets when it closes its eyes. I am not a curse. I am the debt." Naomi did not tremble. She asked, "And what must be paid?" The woman did not speak, but the page turned again. This time it read, "The 13th. Through her I cross. Through you I stay." Naomi's breath caught. "Stay," she whispered. The woman nodded barely, and then in a motion so sudden it made Naomi step back, the woman turned, graceful, precise, and stepped backward into the wardrobe. The door remained open, but the darkness inside was receding. Soft amber light now pulsed gently at the far end like a heartbeat. The wardrobe was no longer just a door, it was a vessel, and Naomi understood what she had to do. The next night, when the 13th opened her eyes again, it would not be the girl who greeted her reflection. It would be something far older, and Naomi would need to remember every story, every secret, every rule, because the house would no longer protect her from what was coming. It would protect what was coming through her. Morning arrived slowly, as though the sun itself hesitated to breach the horizon. The sky bled gray instead of gold, a dull and restless light that filtered through the curtains like memory through fog. Naomi moved quietly through the house. The girl still slept, but her body had changed. It was subtle, too subtle for the untrained eye. A slight tension around the jaw, a stillness to her hands, once so gently restless, now perfectly motionless against the sheets. Her breathing was shallower, precise, measured, and the room around her had begun to shift. The wallpaper curled slightly at the edges. The shadows fell in strange angles, defying the shape of the window. Naomi sat beside her for a while, candle in hand, not lighting it. The silence grew deeper the longer she stayed, as if the house was dimming itself in anticipation. She knew then that the 13th was no longer just the girl. Something was threading its way through her, something vast and ancient that did not yet know how to wear flesh. And when it learned, it would look back through the girl's eyes, and Naomi would be the only one who could hold that gaze. She left the room only when the candle's wax ran cold in her hand. In the kitchen, the journal waited. Another page had turned in the night, though she hadn't touched it. Words spread across the paper like frost on glass. She will not know herself at first. You must remind her who she was before the silence took shape. Speak her name and bind her. Do not hesitate. Memory is the tether. Without it, she will drift. Naomi whispered, "What is her name?" The journal did not answer. Not yet. Outside, the the willow tree had bloomed overnight. Pale white blossoms opened across its branches, releasing a scent she recognized: rosewater old paper and something sweetly bitter, like scorched honey. The 13th stone in the circle now glowed faintly beneath the roots, the bell atop it trembling softly in place. It hadn't rung, but it was listening, waiting. Naomi walked the perimeter of the house barefoot, trailing her fingers along the siding, the shutters, the old porch rail. She was drawing the shape of the house into herself, memorizing every detail, not as a map, but as a hymn. This structure was no longer just a building. It was a conduit, a voice, a memory she had inherited, and now had to pass forward through fear, through time, through blood. That evening, as dusk fell like a heavy curtain, she returned to the attic. The wardrobe door was still open, but the light within had faded. In its place stood a mirror once again, but this one was no longer passive. It reflected not the room, but a different space, a vast chamber of stone and wind, flickering with figures Naomi couldn't fully see. She stared into it for a long time, trying to catch the edges of meaning in the movement, but the reflection offered no clues, just a low rhythmic vibration like chanting heard through earth. When she turned to leave, she found the girl standing at the top of the attic ladder, eyes wide open. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Naomi took her hand and led her down to the circle beneath the willow. The wind picked up as they crossed the field. Each blade of grass leaned toward them as though bending in reverence. The candle Naomi held did not flicker. In the center of the ring, the bell rang once, clear, pure, and the girl blinked. Once, then again, and Naomi saw it, the shift, the thing behind her eyes stepping forward, taking shape, becoming aware. Naomi knelt heart-pounding and whispered the only name she had ever known to carry the weight of silence. Esther. The girl staggered slightly, breath-catching. The blossoms above them began to fall slow as ash, and in that moment, the 13th remembered. The girl swayed where she stood, arms at her sides, head tilted just slightly to the left. Naomi remained kneeling in the grass, unmoving, watching the girl's breath steady into a slow, deliberate rhythm. Around them, the air thickened. The bell at the center of the stone circle ceased its trembling, as if satisfied that its call had been answered. White blossoms drifted from the willow in slow spirals, and the sky above had turned a soft metallic gray, not stormy, but hushed like the breath before a lullaby. Naomi repeated the name again, firmer this time. Esther. The girl blinked once, her lips parted slightly, as though trying to shape a word that had long been buried in her throat. Naomi rose to her feet, slowly, gently, careful not to startle whatever fragile thread had just reconnected. She stepped forward, placing her hands lightly on the girl's shoulders. You remember? I know you do. You've been trying to come home for so long. A flicker passed behind the girl's eyes. Not fear, not confusion, but a brief and powerful ache, like the pain of waking from a dream too old to hold. She opened her mouth, and this time she whispered a single word. Not Naomi's name. Not a phrase, just a sound. Door. Naomi felt the weight of it immediately. The wardrobe, the mirror, the cellar. All of them had been doorways. But this wasn't about passage. It was about return. The girl took Naomi's hand. Together they walked back toward the house. Each step felt slower, more deliberate. The house didn't appear to change yet. Naomi could feel it flexing inward, like something bracing for the last breath in a long-held ritual. The door opened before they reached it, swinging silently inward. The hallway stretched out before them, longer now, slightly tilted, as though space had bent to accommodate what was coming. They didn't stop until they reached the attic. The girl climbed the ladder first. She didn't hesitate. Naomi followed the candle in her hand, still burning tall and steady, though the air had grown cold. At the top, the wardrobe stood open once again. Inside it, a mirror, only this time it no longer reflected anything at all. It was pitch black, a void, but it pulsed faintly as if it were breathing. The girl stepped to the edge of it close enough that her nose nearly brushed the glass. Naomi stood just behind her. Then the girl spoke again, clearer now, her voice layered with something more than childhood. "She's waiting." Naomi nodded, then let her in. At that, the girl raised her hand and pressed her palm to the mirror. The surface rippled, not like water, but like oil pulling away from flame. And then the attic filled with sound, not loud, not screaming, but song, a low, haunting melody, wordless, full of sorrow and strength. The voice of something ancient, something buried too long now finally being called home. The wardrobe glowed faintly. A second shape began to form in the mirror, slow and elegant, a shadow of a woman with no face, only the outline of long hair and arms reaching forward. "Naomi," whispered Esther. The mirror pulsed once. The girl closed her eyes, and then, as gently as a leaf touching ground, she stepped through, not into the mirror, but into the shape, and the shape stepped back. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the girl turned around again, her face calm, but her eyes no longer belonged to a child. They were old. They were hers. Naomi fell to her knees. The 13th had returned, and Esther had come home. Naomi remained kneeling on the attic floor, her hands resting on the wooden boards, the candle at her side, flickering weakly. The girl, no longer just a girl, stood in front of the mirror, the veil between what was and what had returned fully drawn back. She was still her posture, neither threatening nor frail. Her presence filled the attic without sound, without motion. The air around her shimmered faintly, as though memory itself had grown thick enough to touch. Esther had returned, but not as she once was. She had come back carrying something vast within her, a threadwork of knowledge too heavy for one life. Naomi could see it in the way her eyes moved slow and deliberate, as though every blink held centuries. It wasn't possession. It wasn't haunting. It was remembering, fully, perfectly, without mercy. And with that remembering came the toll. Esther stepped forward, bare feet brushing the floor with such lightness that the dust beneath her barely stirred. She looked at Naomi, not with warmth, not with coldness, but with full recognition. A knowing gaze, like one might cast upon a mirror, long lost and finally found again. "You kept it alive," she said softly. Her voice had changed, no longer the uncertain whisper of a child. It carried resonance now, as though more than one voice echoed inside each word. Naomi swallowed, unable to speak. The house, Esther continued. The silence, the pattern. "You carried it until it was ready for me again." Naomi finally found her voice. "Was it ever truly yours?" A flicker of something regret perhaps passed through Esther's gaze. "It was never anyone's. It chooses a vessel, then waits. Sometimes for years, sometimes for lifetimes, but it always remembers." Naomi stood slowly. And now, Esther looked toward the wardrobe. The mirror's glow had faded, but its surface now reflected a field Naomi had never seen: tall grass, dusk-colored sky, a low stone tower at the edge of a forest. The scene pulsed softly, as though waiting for someone to step through. "The house must rest," Esther said. "The line must close, until it's needed again." Naomi felt a tightening in her chest. "And me, you've walked the circle, you've held the thread, but memory must be passed on, or it turns inward." Naomi looked at the mirror, then at Esther. "So this is an ending." Esther stepped closer and placed a hand gently on Naomi's shoulder. "It's the fold before the next page. Not all stories end in silence. Some echo. You'll hear it when it's time." A gust of wind rose from nowhere, sweeping through the attic, like a sigh lifting dust, rattling the candle's flame. Outside, the willow's blossoms began to fall more quickly, each one glowing faintly as it touched the earth. Esther stepped back toward the mirror. The tower in the reflection pulsed brighter. Her outline began to shimmer, the edges of her form gently unraveling into strands of golden light. Naomi reached out instinctively. "Will I remember you?" "You already do." And then Esther stepped into the mirror. The light flared once, then dimmed. The wardrobe door creaked shut, and the attic fell silent again. Naomi stood alone, the candle flickering beside her, but the silence no longer felt hollow. It felt whole. Naomi didn't leave the attic right away. The candle beside her guttered low in its dish, casting long shadows across the warped boards beneath her feet. The wardrobe stood closed, its surface cool and still, the mirror within no longer glowing, no longer reflecting. Only a faint line of dust marked where the door had opened and where it had shut, as if the threshold itself had exhaled and gone to sleep. She touched the handle gently. Nothing moved. No pull, no hum, no flicker behind the glass. It was just a wardrobe again. But Naomi understood now that just had never applied to anything in this house. Everything held echoes. Everything waited. Descending the attic ladder, she was surprised at how normal the house looked. Not pristine, not untouched. Just still. The floorboards creaked as they always had. The curtains stirred slightly in the open window. The smell of dust and old wood lingered in the air, warm and familiar. But beneath it all was something new, or rather, something no longer present. The pressure that had sat on the house for decades, centuries perhaps, was gone. Not banished, not defeated, but fulfilled. The girl's bed was empty. The sheets were undisturbed, folded down at the edge, as though she'd simply gotten up early and gone for a walk. Naomi didn't search for her. She knew there'd be no footprints in the garden, no reflection in the mirror, no voice waiting in the dark. Esther was gone, not vanished, but absorbed into whatever place had waited for her beyond the mirror, in the house. The house had let her go. Naomi sat on the front steps for a long while, watching the willow shed the last of its blossoms. The wind had returned, gentle warm curling through the tall grass, like fingers braiding memory into soil. The 13th stone was still in the center of the circle, but its glow had dimmed. The bell beside it sat perfectly still, silent. Its purpose was complete. As dusk deepened, Naomi returned inside. She lit the 12 candles once more, one in each room, moving clockwise, as she had done for so many nights. But when she reached the 13th, she didn't place it on the kitchen table. She didn't light it. She placed it in the center of the hallway, set a match beside it, and left it unburned. Let the silence hold it, let it wait, because there would be another 13th one day, and someone else would need to remember. That night Naomi finally slept. No dreams, no visions, no whispering echoes behind the walls, only the deep velvet black of true rest, and somewhere far beyond the reach of mirrors or attics or ancient roots, a tower of stone watched silently over a field where nothing stirred, waiting as all things sacred do to be remembered again. Naomi awoke to birdsong. Not the heavy silence she had grown accustomed to, not the creaks and groans of the house shifting in its bones, but the ordinary melodic trill of morning birds somewhere just beyond the orchard. It took her a moment to register it. The sound was so gentle, so alive, that for the first time in weeks she smiled without reason. A smile not tied to relief or completion, just presence. She rose slowly, muscles still carrying the heaviness of what had passed, though her spirit felt strangely light, like her skin had been dusted off from within. The house was quiet, yes, but not with the weighted hush of watching eyes or old memories pressing against the walls. This quiet was clean, natural, the kind you only find after something long and difficult has ended. Naomi brewed tea for the first time in days. The kettle didn't shriek. It sang a soft hiss, not unlike the sound of the candle flames whispering in the corners of the house. She drank it by the window, staring out at the willow tree. The circle of stones remained, though the 13th stone had lost its shimmer. It now looked like the others, worn rounded, humbled by time. A relic, not a beacon. As the hours passed, Naomi moved from room to room, blowing out each of the 12 candles. Not with ceremony, just a small breath of thanks. When she reached the final room, the attic, she paused at the ladder. A part of her wanted to leave it be, to let the space above remain untouched for now. But something gentle stirred within her. Not urgency, but a quiet invitation. She climbed. The attic smelled of old wood and morning light. Dust motes drifted lazily through the air. The wardrobe remained shut, its surface no longer humming. Naomi stepped forward and placed her palm on its face. It was cool, unyielding. Just furniture now. She didn't try to open it. There was no need. The work was done. The mirror inside had been a window, a door, a promise, and now a memory. In the corner beside the attic window sat the journal. Still open to the last written page, its ink dry and faded. Naomi crossed the floor and lifted it carefully. A single line had been added in the night. When the roots are quiet, the branches remember. She closed the book and held it to her chest, then turned, descended the ladder, and placed the journal back in its drawer. Days passed. Naomi began tending the garden again. She cleaned the windows. She read books she hadn't touched in years. She walked barefoot through the grass, letting the soil remember her. The wind returned more frequently, carrying warmth instead of voices. The willow stood silent, but no longer haunted. It shaded the circle like a guardian at ease. People in the nearby town began asking after her again, soft, curious questions about the old house on the hill, whether she still lived there alone, whether she was all right. Naomi answered kindly when she chose to. But she didn't explain. Not because they wouldn't believe her, but because belief wasn't the point. Memory, after all, isn't always meant to be shared. Sometimes it's meant to be kept quietly, tenderly, until the right voice comes along to carry it forward. And one day, someone would come, a girl or a boy, or someone with eyes like mirrors, and when they knocked, Naomi would know. She'd light the candles again. She'd walk the rooms in silence. She'd prepare the house to remember, because the 13th always returns. The summer deepened. Heat settled low across the fields, and the orchard trees grew heavy with fruit. Naomi spent her mornings pruning, her afternoons mending curtains or washing windows already clean. The house seemed to stretch under the weight of the sun, the boards creaking. Not from old memory now, but from warmth. Honest, heavy, harmless. It was the first time in years that the stillness in the air wasn't followed by a whisper. Each day, Naomi passed the 13th stone beneath the willow tree. She didn't touch it. She didn't speak to it. But she acknowledged it with a glance, a kind of silent pact between keeper and kept. The circle was no longer a gate. It was a scar. And scars don't hurt when they heal, right? They just remind. One evening, as the sky turned the deep violet of a summer dusk, Naomi returned from the orchard, carrying a basket of pears. She stopped at the edge of the porch, watching the distant shadows stretch across the fields. A faint breeze moved through the tall grass, bending it in waves like breath. The house behind her gave a single pop in its bones, as if yawning. And then nothing. Stillness again, but not silence, not exactly, because that was when she heard the singing, soft, distant. A child's voice, though not a song she recognized. Just a low, repeating tune that rose and fell like it was being carried on the wind. Naomi turned toward the sound basket, still in hand. She didn't panic. She didn't move, not at first. She only listened. The melody was neither sad nor joyful, just remembering. The song faded as the sky darkened. That night, Naomi stood in the attic again. The wardrobe hadn't moved, but the mirror inside had reappeared in her dreams the night before. No flickers, no shadows, only her own face, older than she expected, watching her with knowing eyes. She reached for the handle, not to open it, just to rest her fingers there, as if to ask without asking, "Are you sleeping or waiting?" No reply came, but the wood was warmer than she remembered. The next morning, she found a small object on the porch, a single red marble resting on the step. It hadn't been there the night before. She picked it up slowly, heart calm, pulse steady, and smiled, because marbles were how Esther had marked her place in the beginning. Long before the songs, before the circle, before the wardrobe had opened, just a girl hiding trinkets in shadow to remember where she'd been. Naomi lifted the marble to the light. It glinted with gold at its core. She placed it gently on the windowsill beside the journal and whispered, "I see you." The wind answered, brushing her cheek like a hand. Not a threat, not a warning, just a greeting. Naomi began waking earlier now before the sun. Not because the house stirred her or because of dreams, but because of a subtle pull, something beneath the surface of her routine, a rhythm she couldn't quite name, but knew how to follow. She would rise quietly, cross the wooden floor barefoot, and stand by the kitchen window, watching as the first gray light crept into the world. She listened not for voices or echoes, but for movement. Something was beginning again. The marble on the windowsill never shifted, but each morning the light inside it glowed just a little brighter. Once golden, it now shimmered faintly red like an ember catching breath. Naomi never touched it again. Some things didn't need handling. They only needed witnessing. On the third day after she found it, she noticed a pattern forming. A strand of yarn barely visible had begun to appear in the hallway. Not left there, not draped, but woven into the seams between the boards. Pale gray thread like spider silk trailing from the foot of the stairs and leading up slowly, deliberately toward the attic. Naomi followed it with her eyes and saw that it vanished beneath the closed wardrobe door. She said nothing. Instead, she walked the house quietly, preparing again. She didn't clean. She didn't polish the mirrors or sweep the corners. What she did was more careful. She turned all the clocks to face the wall. She placed bowls of water near the hearth, just enough to reflect the ceiling. She took the bell and set it back on the 13th stone, not to ring it, but to remind it. The circle wasn't active, not yet, but it was awake. That night the singing returned, this time closer. Naomi sat by the attic window as the sound drifted through the orchard. Not a full melody, just the same 4 notes rising and falling in a lullaby rhythm. She closed her eyes and breathed with it slow and even, and the house breathed too. The floor beneath her felt warm. The wardrobe did not creak. The mirror remained closed. But when Naomi opened her eyes again, she was not alone. The girl stood in the doorway. Not Esther. Not the 13th. A new girl. Perhaps 12. Perhaps younger, barefoot and wide-eyed, with a ribbon in her hair that trailed in a breeze that wasn't there. She looked at Naomi with cautious familiarity, as though she recognized the house before she recognized the person. Naomi did not rise. She only nodded. "You heard it," Naomi said softly. The girl nodded. Naomi patted the floor beside her. "Come sit." The child moved quietly, folding herself beside Naomi's knees drawn to her chest. Together they listened. The song faded, then returned. This time from the field, then from behind the walls, then from within the wardrobe. The girl whispered, "I saw her in my sleep." Naomi didn't need to ask who. She was holding a thread. She said it belonged to me, but I lost the needle. Naomi smiled gently. "We always do at first." And as the wind picked up beyond the attic window and the branches of the willow reached again toward the glass, Naomi knew. The next 13th had found its way, and the house had begun its remembering, all over again. Morning brought with it a thin fog, rolling slow and low across the fields like silk unraveling from a spool. The girl slept in Naomi's old room beneath the slanted ceiling, curled beneath a quilt too big for her frame. her ribbon left on the bedside table beside a half-drunk glass of water. Naomi stood at the window, watching the gray curtain outside shift and breathe. Somewhere beyond the willow, something stirred, but not with urgency. With memory, downstairs, the yarn thread had grown. It now stretched along the baseboards, tracing familiar paths: the kitchen doorway, the cellar stairs, the frame of the old sewing room. Naomi didn't touch it. Instead, she knelt at the end of the hall where the line had begun and whispered softly, "If you're weaving, I'll hold the frame." She didn't expect a response, but the wardrobe opened that night on its own, not wide, just enough to show the edge of the mirror. The surface rippled faintly, not like water, but like heat. Naomi climbed into the attic slowly, candle in hand, the light from its flame dancing softly across the walls. The girl was already there, sitting cross-legged near the window. She hadn't spoken since that first night, but Naomi could feel her awareness deepening, shifting beneath the surface of her quietness. "The house is starting to sing," the girl said suddenly. Naomi paused on the top step. The girl continued, voice dreamy. "It's not words, not yet, just humming, like it's tuning itself." Naomi walked over and placed the candle near her. "It always begins that way. Did it sing for you too?" Naomi smiled gently. "It did. And for Esther. And for the ones before." The girl reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a second marble green and clear. She rolled it between her fingers. "She gave this to me in the dream. Said it was a key. But it doesn't open anything." Naomi crouched beside her. "Not doors, not locks, but it opens memory." She held out her palm, and the girl placed the marble in it. The mirror inside the wardrobe glowed brighter. Naomi turned to look. In its reflection, the attic remained unchanged, except for one thing: a thread of yarn now extended from the mirror's surface, spiraling gently outward, hovering just above the floor. It stretched to Naomi's hand, then connected thread to marble to memory. The girl gasped softly. "She's inside again." Naomi nodded. "No, you are." The wardrobe creaked fully open. From within, a warm light spilled out, not blinding, not forceful, gentle, like dawn rising inside a familiar room. Naomi stood, and this time she didn't hesitate. She took the girl's hand and stepped forward. They stood at the edge together, peering into the reflection, not of the attic now, but of the orchard in full bloom. The willow tree bore blossoms the color of blood and snow, and in the center of the circle of stones stood Esther, not as a child, not as a ghost, but whole. She raised her hand. The girl stepped closer to the mirror, breath-quickening eyes wide. Naomi bent down and whispered in her ear, "Say her name. She'll remember you if you do." The girl's lips parted, and just as the candle flame bent sharply in a sudden gust of invisible wind, the girl spoke. "Esther." The mirror did not ripple. It opened, not with noise, but with welcome. The mirror opened like a breath held too long, finally being released, not violently, not with light or sound, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that stretches time, where everything slows just enough for the moment to widen, deepen, and become unforgettable. Naomi didn't move. The girl stood with her hand still raised, her gaze fixed on the figure within. Esther, whole radiant in the soft, pulsing light, smiled gently, her expression, not of triumph, but of peace long delayed. Naomi stepped back, letting the girl approach alone. This was not hers to carry now. The memory had passed, the echo made whole. The girl stood before the mirror, and Esther knelt inside it, not behind glass, not behind illusion, but in a space between where neither the living nor the forgotten ruled. "Are you ready?" Esther asked, her voice woven with hundreds of others, not loud but infinite. The girl nodded. Naomi watched as the girl stepped into the threshold, not vanishing, not dissolving, but folding gently into the light. The mirror brightened, then dimmed, and the door closed. No bang, no lock, just closure. Naomi stood in the attic long after the mirror faded back into wood and dust. The wardrobe no longer hummed, no longer breathed. The attic was just an attic again. When she descended the ladder, the house had changed in the subtlest way. The air was lighter. The floorboards no longer groaned, they sighed. She opened all the windows, letting the breeze move through every room, touching each corner like a final blessing. The thread was gone. The marble remained faintly warm, resting on the sill. That evening, Naomi walked to the willow. The 13th stone pulsed once beneath her feet, then went still. The bell did not ring. It didn't need to. Its work, like hers, was complete. She placed her hand against the tree's trunk. It felt familiar. It always would. As night came, she returned to the attic one final time. She lit a single candle, not for summoning, not for guarding, but for remembering. The house, the mirror, the name, all now part of the tapestry she had helped weave. And when she closed the wardrobe door that night, she knew she'd never need to open it again. Not in this life, not in this house. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. You've made it through, and now all that remains is stillness. No more mirrors to watch. No more footsteps behind the walls. Only the calm that follows a long journey, well walked. The house you imagined, with its creaking floorboards, an attic full of memory, now settles back into rest. The circle is whole again. The candles are dark, and your breath steady soft mirrors the hush that lives in spaces once haunted, now healed. Let your thoughts drift like the blossoms falling from the willow tree. Let the image of Naomi, of Esther, of the girl with the ribbon fade gently, like fog in the morning sun. There's no need to hold them now. They'll return if they're ever needed again. But tonight they've gone quiet, tucked into the corners of your mind where dreams bloom slowly and without fear. The 13th is no longer waiting. The house remembers, and so do you. Now let your eyes grow heavy. Let your heartbeat find the rhythm of the wind through open windows. You are safe. You are far from the mirror, and sleep gentle, dreamless waits just behind your next breath.